Good morning. It is Tuesday here in Chicago. Beautiful sunrise today, but very windy this morning. Winds whipping off the lake. Pretty strong gusts. Oh, it's a nice little break from the wind. Today, I've been running with Polar updated watches, the Vantage M2 and the Ignite 2 for the past week. Every single run, running with them. After a run today, go back inside, check out how accurate they are.
Yo, what's going on, everybody? We are back now inside after the run, and with today's run I now have 8 days of data comparing the Polar Vantage M2 and the Polar Ignite 2 in what is, long-term review I guess isn't the right way to look at it. Let's call it the extended review. I've gone on it for 8 days of running, a little bit more than I think 10 hours of running in both of the watches, having one watch on each wrist for that entire time. And then living with it 24 hours a day. So it gives me a really great sense of what this watch is going to do. And I'm going to try and keep this video a little bit shorter, although it is going to get long because we're going to go over the data for each of the runs for every single day. So that way you guys that are really wanting to look at the numbers can get a chance to look at the numbers, but I'll also do a lot of summarizing in the beginning. And I'll also refer you to the other video that I made for the Polar buying guide, whether you should get the Ignite 2, the M2, or the Vantage V2, which I also have. Before I get into any of that though, I do want to go over some disclosures. All 3 of these watches were provided to me by Polar for the purpose of review. However, they're not paying me to make this video. They don't know that I'm making this video. They haven't had a chance to see any of my data or my numbers, and they're not going to get a chance to preview any of my footage or my thoughts before you guys get a chance to see this video on YouTube. So with that disclosure out of the way, let's talk about the Polar Ignite 2 and the Vantage M2. With the Polar Ignite 2, I absolutely love the screen on this watch. It is so bright and so vibrant. But I also feel like that this screen also creates a lot of problems for me too. Problems that I feel like I understand why things are like that. I just wish that they weren't somehow. And they're just little things that started to annoy me after a little bit longer time using it. So one of the things is that there's only one button, which I'm just generally not a huge fan of just having the one button. I like to have more buttons, especially for something that I'm gonna be using while I'm out there running and trying to press it. Not that I'm doing that all the time, but it is something that does come up. So having just the one button becomes a little bit of an annoyance, especially because the main way that you interact with the Ignite 2 is through its really beautiful touchscreen. Now, the way that Polar has set up this touchscreen is that it errs on the side of missed touches rather than accidental touches. So I also run with an Apple Watch from time to time. I use that to play music or audiobooks, and if I don't want to carry my phone around. And so during this period of testing for me, sometimes on my right wrist, I would have the Ignite 2 and the Apple Watch immediately next to each other. And it's been a little bit chilly, so I've had gloves on for a lot of this testing. And there'd be times where I would be able to interact with the Apple Watch just fine, but then the same type of touching that I want to do on the Ignite 2, it wouldn't register the touches a lot of the time. And so what I find is that I have to take off my glove and then try it. And even then, it usually took me a couple times to start the recording activity. So that is a little bit annoying that it's not doing what I wanted to do every single time. But on the other hand, something that happens to me with the Apple Watch is that I'll be running if I have a longer sleeve on, and not that I'm getting like super sweaty underneath all my stuff, but sometimes even in the dead of winter, it just might get clammy kind of like in the sleeve. And there were times where like that moisture or humidity that's in there would cause a press on the Apple Watch. So like music might be playing and all of a sudden it pauses, or it skips to the next track, or it skips to just another app entirely. Weird things are happening underneath there. I'm not sure exactly why. None of that stuff has been happening with the Ignite. It's not like it accidentally paused my run like halfway through the run and I didn't lose any data. So if that's kind of like the trade-off, I think that Polar has made the right decision in being like a little bit more conservative in terms of registering touches. The other thing that I don't love about this Ignite watch though is that like the screen seems to be a bit like kind of just laggy overall. Like when you lift up your wrist to kind of look at it, I don't see the watch turn on. And so I wish that there were a way that I could choose, kind of like Apple Watches do these days, where you could kind of have an always on but dim and then a brighter versus an off and then on, because that I think would probably solve a lot of my problems. But again, I understand that it's gonna hit the battery life when you do that. So the other thing that I wish I could do is I wish it was just a little bit more sensitive. Hopefully that they can tweak that. Now, since I made my first review of the Ignite 2, I did get some updates to the watch that were pushed through the app. And since then, the battery life has definitely improved. So it felt like I was getting like maybe like a day and a half's worth of battery life out of this watch per charge. Now it seems like the battery life, even though this screen is much brighter, is much more in line with what I was getting from the M2 in terms of like wearing it all day, having it track me through everything that I'm doing, track me through my sleep, and then track me during the run. After a run, I'd be closer to like 85% if I started at 100% like a day ago. And by the time I was taking the watches off so I could take a shower and get ready for the day, by the time that I put the watches back on, they were both back up to 100%. So like, this is definitely something now with the update. This is a much more livable watch. You're still gonna probably need to bring the charger with you if you're going somewhere for like a longer weekend or like a running adventure. But it's something in terms of my day-to-day use. I usually only charge my watch when I'm taking a shower and I have the watch off, and this is definitely going to be able to work for me now. So I think that the Ignite 2, especially at its price point of $230, I love that price point for this watch. I think is a great first running watch for a lot of people. Now moving over to the Vantage M2. This is the watch that I prefer at $299. I feel like the price point at that one is also really good. With that bump up in price, you also get a bump up in features. It's fully compatible with my Stryd foot pod, which is a main way that I train. It's something that I put on my shoes every single day for all of my runs. It gives me improved pace and distance and cadence information, which I appreciate. It also has more buttons, which seems like kind of like a really like petty thing to be really concerned about, but I just like having more buttons. I like being able to interact with a small screen like a watch face with buttons rather than on a touch screen. Now this doesn't even have any touch capability on it at all, so you're only interacting with it through the buttons, but I do really appreciate that there's so many and the user interface is pretty intuitive. Polar goes back and forth between having round buttons and longer buttons on the variety of its watches. I don't find that I have a preference in terms of the shape of the button, or maybe I do, because the big thing is on the M2, the buttons just don't seem as easily pressable for me. I find like I have to be a little bit more kind of like deliberate when I'm pressing the buttons. Here on the Vantage V2, they've got longer buttons, and I think they're just a little bit more like clicky. And so like, I feel like when I want to press a button, it just feels like I gotta like really think about it a little bit more. Again, not a huge thing, but if it's something where you're hitting laps, you're trying to do something during the middle of a workout, it's just something that it comes up, you notice it. Now overall for both these watches, the GPS, and we'll take a look at the data in a little bit more detail, I think is pretty good. I run in a city urban area, so there are times where it's excellent and there's times where it gets kind of goofy, but for the most part, both of them are pretty accurate to each other, and they're pretty close to the independent GPS independent data that I'm getting from my Stryd foot pod. So I think that they're all doing a pretty good job. I do also find that the cadence is a little bit high on the wrist on the Ignite 2 compared to what I was getting on the M2, but a lot of that M2 is coming from the foot pod. So that's going to be a little bit of a difference there. And I do find that the altimeter or the altitude readings on both of these watches are pretty weird. I wouldn't really try to base any of my training off of any of the altitude data coming off of each of these watches, because that altitude information is coming from GPS and kind of like pulling it off of a table rather than doing like an independent measurement. And we'll take a look at that too. And I think it's probably a good place to go into the deep dive of the data itself. So let's just do that. Here we're going to take a look at my computer, and we'll go backwards from today. So we'll start on the 30th today. We've got the power that's up here coming from the Stryd foot pod. We had a set of, it looks like 6 strides today. There's a 7th spike here, or this first spike is actually from me coming up that flight of stairs which you saw. So that's what that is, but otherwise this is 6 strides for today. The heart rates in this test, the later testing that I did, I put external heart rate monitors attached to each of these watches. So I was wearing a chest strap and an armband, and had one paired with each of the watches. And so we're looking at these two, and you can see that for the most part, whether I'm using a chest strap or whether I'm using the armband, the two tracings are pretty much spot on. The peaks are peaking at the same spot, and the troughs are like, bottoming out at the same spots, with a couple of dropouts here and there, it looks like. But for the most part, there do seem to be like translated over a little bit. And I think that's a difference between like in timing between when like the chest strap gets the heart data, and which is closer to your heart, and then like the armband. So I think that's why the data graphs look the way that they do. In terms of cadence, you could see here that they are again pretty close, but it looks like that when there's differences, it's let's scroll over here. It looks like it's the Ignite 2 that's always just like a little bit higher. And even in some other areas where I'm just kind of like going at a chill, easy pace, the Ignite 2 is a little bit higher than the cadence, which is going to be coming off of the Stryd foot pod at this point. But as far as that distance is concerned, they're both pretty much spot on, hitting the same distance. And for elevation, the elevation is like a little bit wonky. Here, I'm hitting the flyover over by Navy Pier, but I don't think the difference in height is quite that. So I might be picking up in terms of, it doesn't go from like 175 or like 177 meters to 207 meters. It's not quite that big. So I'm not sure exactly where that height is coming from. It's a hill over there, but it's not that big of a hill. So I think one of the ways that we can look at some of where some of that wonkiness might be coming from is if we take a look at the data here. The difficult part here particularly is coming down this stretch along the waterfront. There's a lot of really tall buildings that are right here, and I feel like that can kind of confuse the GPS. And if you look at it, it looks like the M2's GPS is like kind of pretty tightly compacted. It was an out and back. So I was running along this lakefront trail, but this little like white path for the lakefront trail is a little bit misleading. There's been some slight changes, and there's differences in where like the runners are supposed to be versus where the cyclists are supposed to be. So it gives you an idea of where I'm supposed to be, but it's not like the true where I actually was necessarily. But it gives you an idea. And what you could see is like usually the Ignite 2 is kind of like when the GPS starts freaking out, it's the Ignite 2's GPS that is freaking out a little bit more than the M2's. And then we get to this part down here here's where the kind of the flyover starts. And then I made a hard left and turned back around, and then did a U-turn to come back underneath, come up some stairs. I think that's what this little kind of like that tuck-in point is right there. And then I'm coming back down, but I was coming back down along the same like relatively narrow pathway, and so it's not quite this wide, so it's both of them are kind of freaking out. But again, here in this area there's a lot of bridges and tall buildings in the way, so lots of stuff to give some interference. And so that kind of gives you an idea of like how kind of like weird the GPS can be between two of the same watches on the same person. Now, I know that there's differences between running and comparing something that's on your left wrist, on your right wrist, and wrist placement. If there's other watches nearby, like I mentioned on the right wrist, I had the Polar Ignite 2 and an Apple Watch on there, so that can be affecting things as well. So maybe it's not so much the fact that the Ignite 2's GPS is worse, it just might be because I have other things interfering with the signal. But for the most part, if we look at the overall distance, at the end of the day, the Ignite 2 came in with 12.91 kilometers. And the M2, which had the Stryd footpod connected, came in at 12.92 kilometers. So over the course of 12, almost 13K, it was a difference of 0.01K. So the GPS tracings look different, but in terms of the overall distance, not a huge impact. So let's go look at the 29th, the day before that. The 29th was a long run. I had mostly long run, a mile of bigger or marathon pace. So like the power numbers were a little bit higher, and then right into 4 strides. So you could see those 4 spikes there. Here, there's a little gap in the data, and that's because I brought my GoPro with me, and then I forgot my data, like the SD card at home, because I just pulled some video footage off of it for the videos editing that morning. So I had to go back home, and so there's a little pause or break in the data. For this one, I think what's going on here, oh yeah, for this one, I forgot to bring the heart rate monitor, the chest strap for the M2. Here is an example of what the heart rate tracing looks like from the Ignite 2, that's this lower one right here, with a armband. I used the Verity Sense connected to the Ignite 2, and then this taller tracing is here from the M2, and that's just from the watch itself, and you could see that it's much higher, it's way off. There were a couple of dropouts that the Ignite kind of like picked up here, but for the most part it's giving me like a type of tracing that I would expect. As I switched over from easy running to that marathon pace mile, it was pretty gradual increase, and then we had 4 little spikes here that correspond to the strides that I did. 15 seconds on, and then 45 or 20 seconds on, and then 40 seconds of recovery jogging for those strides. So you get the little spikes that are in there. But from the wrist-based heart rate monitor on the M2, it was just kind of all over the place the entire time, and the spikes were just absolutely insane. So it's definitely collecting not only my heart rate, but also some of the movement. So it's collecting some of kind of like my cadence as well. And that's the main, I get that with no matter what watch I use. We'll have some data later on that we'll look at the Ignite 2 without a heart rate monitor attached, and you're gonna see kind of the same thing. I think it's just the way that like my bones kind of are, maybe it's my skin tone, I'm not sure what, but I always have to use an external heart rate monitor. And here we've got cadence, and again you could see that like the Ignite 2 is always a little bit higher than the cadence I'm getting from my Stryd foot pod, but for the most part they're pretty close. Relatively close together. And on this one, the elevation also is just, it's pretty close to each other, but also a little bit wonky. One of the things here is you'll notice on all of my graphs that the elevation always starts out really high. And I think that's because the whole like GPS based altitude versus sensor based altitude, I think, but some of the GPS tracings, it's picking me up at like where a building is, and so it's getting like the altitude from the building and not from where I'm actually standing. And so that's where a lot of this stuff is, because here, if you think about it here, this is where I'm like at home, this spot here, because I came back into the building, so that's that. But this is more of like what it was like when I was actually out there running. So it's doing a pretty good job for both of these. They're a little bit closer than they are in some of the other ones that I've looked at. And let me give you an example of kind of what that looks like here when we're talking about the altitude and like some of that wonkiness that we could see from the GPS. So this is like towards the beginning of my run as I'm entering the park. And here what I'm doing is I'm running on the south side of Oakdale Avenue to get into the park. But there are tall buildings, like I could reach out my hand and touch the tall buildings. There's no space between, like, there's basically like 2 feet between the sidewalk and the building here, and it's they're like mid rises, probably like 12, 13 stories, I think. I haven't counted before, but they're not like super tall, but they're enough to give some interference, I think. And on the left hand side, there's some very tall buildings and some just regular size structures. So like here, it's just getting really confused, and so I think that if the satellite is placing me here, like on the rooftop of this building, the elevation data I'm getting is going to be from there. And so I think by the time I pass all these buildings and get into the park, now I'm in like a green space. that's where that dip is in that altitude data. For this particular run, there was a little bit more variance than I've seen in other ones. So this is a pretty big difference in distance. So the Ignite 2 gave me 17.75 Ks, and the Ignite M2 with the FootPod gave me 18.15 Ks. So it was off by quite a bit there, off by what, 0.35 kilometers over about 18 Ks of distance. So that's a little bit bigger of a difference, and that's the main reason why I switched over to using the FootPod, is because in the city, the readings get a little bit more difficult. And if you look at this particular run, I spent a lot more of that time running towards downtown. So there's a lot more opportunity for interference from those other tall buildings. And so I think that's primarily where I'm getting a lot of that difference, that variance, is when I'm over in the taller building areas here. And so like with this one, I'm going down and I'm doing the out and back. I do kind of like a loop, and this one I'm going down and there's like a little grassy area, and then it goes from the concrete, the grassy area, and then like a little bit of a dirt path. So I did that, but it looks like, and this darker color is the M2 and this lighter color is the Ignite. So it looks like wasn't sure if I was doing just an out and back or if I was, if I had gone on a separate path, which I had. And so I was trying to figure that out. I think it's trying to I don't know what it's doing, but it's not exactly capturing where I am. And so there's a little bit of variance here that's happening. For the most part, I think it's doing a pretty good job, but over by the river, this is like a giant metal structure, and I'm not quite this far out in the water. So there's just lots of stuff that's happening over here. And I think that's what's causing these differences in GPS. All right, so with that, let's go to the next one. Let's go to the 28th. This was a Sunday. This is just an easy run, I think, going out here. And let's see, heart rate. Both of the watches right now have an extra heart rate monitor attached. The Ignite 2 is still giving me that higher cadence. Elevation is still just kind of like all over the place. And let's see, as far as ultimate distance, they were a lot closer today, 0.2 kilometers off for this 16 kilometer run. So again, when I am spending more time running closer to downtown, I do think that I'm getting a little bit more interference in terms of the GPS. For the 27th, this is a day where it was, I believe it was 6 times 4 minutes. At threshold pace, so that was a nice workout here. Only getting the power data from the FootPod that's connected to the Vantage M2. The heart rates, I think, again, are doing a great job. Both of the heart rate monitors, I'm using a Sunto chest strap and a Polar armband. Both of them are doing just fine. The cadences, they're doing a fine job picking up the differences in the cadences. But again, the Ignite 2 always seems a little bit higher than the Stryd FootPod. Again, we've got some variances in the elevation, which I don't really pay attention too much to. In Chicago, everything's pretty much flat, so I don't really care. And the difference, again, here we got a 15K run, about 9 miles, and the Ignite 2 is kind of underreporting some of my mileage again. All right, next one, let's go to, this one's gonna be interesting because we got a hill workout here on this one, I think. Yeah, 26th Friday. So when I'm looking over to the side, I'm looking at my notes. So we've got a hill workout here, and you can see it on the power meter that I just ran the hill a whole bunch of times. I didn't really count it, and I was trying to stay pretty even effort, but even then, it's a hill. So I did 8 times apparently going up and down the hill. You could see the heart rate did spike a little bit. Over here, I'm also high because I'm running through some rocks, and that takes a little bit more effort from me. I'm not running on kind of like easy pavement through here. So heart rate staying a little bit kind of high, but generally trying to keep it a little bit mellow. And let's see what that does to the cadence. So the cadence is going to jump around a bit. On this one, it seems like the Ignite 2's cadence when I'm going up and down the hills a lot is dropping out quite a bit. So I'm not sure what's going on with that, if it is the difference in like mechanics of running up and down hill or what, but it does seem like I'm getting some dropouts in terms of the cadence. I don't really look at cadence all that much, but it is a data point that's kind of like interesting to see here. So I'll tell you guys about it. And here, this is where like the elevation is just like totally wonky because here it looks like I didn't do any hill work at all. But let's look at here, this 2246 point. That's where at least the power numbers are telling me that this is where I start hitting the hills. They end right here a little bit after this 3746. And yeah, it doesn't show me any altitude information. If we go over to my Stryd, I did this same or similar type of workout with the Vantage V, which has a barometric altimeter on it. So it's detecting what my altitude changes are, not like extrapolating it from GPS. So this is kind of the same area over here. And I can show you like the GPS tracing on this map. It's the same thing. So we're doing kind of like, there's a loop. You go, I kind of do like a figure 8. No, it's kind of, I guess it's more like an hourglass. So I go up one side, I turn around, come back the other, and I just do like loops that way. And so I've got like the same kind of GPS tracing, but the Vantage V2 gives me a much different sense of the readings of in the altitude. And it's also giving me, doesn't give me that giant like roller coaster downhill, because it's not picking up my GPS or my altitude from GPS. This is what my actual altitude changes are. So it's letting me know that this hill that I'm talking about is about, you know, we got started from like 2.68 to 2.8. So it's about 0.12 miles long. So what is that, like 100 meters? So 200 meters. So yeah, no, it was about 100 meters, right? So 0.25 would be a quarter of 400 meters. So 0.12 would be about 200 meters long. Yeah, I don't know. It's taking me a long time to do math today. So about a quarter mile, 200 meters long. And at most it gives me a 5 degree grade. But you know, it eases into it, starts at like 2 and 3% and eases up to 5. And so that's what it is. And in the variance of height, if we're looking at the altitude is 588 feet to 614 feet. So like 30 feet of gain over the course of 200 meters. So not a giant hill, but enough for, you know, your body to register it. So that's the altitude changes that it's giving me. But as far as like the GPS is concerned, it doesn't even really notice. For this one I went north, away from the city and away from buildings, rather than south, which is toward more buildings. So I think that there was less GPS interference between the two. So the Ignite 2 is coming in very close to the M2 at 10.56K. All right, let's keep going here to the 25th now. For the 25th, this is Thursday. For some reason, and this is weird, I had the Vantage M2 with me, and I thought I had the power meter also attached to it, but I don't have any data from Thursday. So that's a bit weird. This was supposed to be just an easy day, so you're just looking at just the heart rate information for the Ignite 2. It's really rare that I don't get recordings from a watch. And for whatever reason, like the M2 didn't record. I mean, I can think of one other time that's ever happened to me on a Polar watch or any running specific watch before. So it's really unusual that it happened here. But if a weird thing's gonna happen, I'm glad that it happens when you know, I'm doing some testing on the watch. So 10.45K for this one. This is my normal kind of out and back. This one is about right for distance. It's usually a little bit more than 6 miles. So again, nothing to compare it to on this one, but gives you an example of the data. And here there's a kind of a big spike in terms of the elevation change. And that's definitely not something that actually happened. Again, something that's like the GPS is picking up something weird. 24th. I didn't have a power meter on for this one. So for this one, the M2 did have the heart rate monitor. It had a chest strap. The Ignite did not have a heart rate monitor turned on. I just went from the wrist. And so what you could see here is for this is 3 miles at threshold, 2 miles jog, and 2 more miles at threshold. This tracing is kind of what I would expect, easing into it, or at least I'm going at threshold pace and effort, but the heart rate kind of slowly climbs up over time and ending kind of in that heart rate range for threshold, right around 170 for me. But on the wrist-based, it's just pegging up really high at 180, like a little bit over 180, which is like my heart rate max. And it's even giving me up to 190 over here, which is way above my heart rate max. So the wrist-based heart rate monitor, doesn't matter if it's the Ignite 2, the M2, just doesn't really work for me, and I need to be able to use an external heart rate monitor. For this one, the cadence is pretty similar to each other, and there wasn't a power meter for the Vantage M2 on this one. So all those times where I've said like the Ignite 2's cadence is a little high, I think that's just the way that Polar picks up cadence versus the way a FootPod picks up cadence. And then again, the elevation is doing some weird stuff down here that I don't think is an accurate depiction of what's actually going on. And as far as distance, they're both the same because the GPS on the distance coming from GPS on both of these watches. So 16.76 for each of them. So now let's take a look at the 23rd. And on this one, it looks like down here, it's the M2 that I have a heart rate monitor attached to. Looks like I did some strides on this one. And then the Ignite 2, again, the heart rates are just kind of all over the place because that wrist-based heart rate isn't working for me. The cadence, cadence for both of these is coming from the wrist for each of the watches. So they're pretty much spot on with each other. So there doesn't seem to be a difference in terms of picking up cadence for each of these watches. And then the elevation is coming from GPS. So again, it's just super wonky. And the distance on these, both of these are coming from the GPS this time, 12.91 versus the 12.98. So pretty close, but a little bit of variance there. So if there's anything in the data that you'd like to take a look at further, let me know about it. I still have the data, so I can always refer back to it. Put it in the comments down below, or better yet, feel free to stop by the live stream I do just about every day on YouTube, 3 p.m. Central Time. You can always ask me anything you like there. That's all I have for today, everybody. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end of the video. Hopefully you guys are staying safe out there on your runs, and I'll see you in the next one.
Yo, what's going on?